Today is June 11th, 2008. My name is Martin Frank. I'm the Executive Director of the American Physiological Society. Today I have the pleasure and honor of interviewing Dr. Beverly Bishop for the Society's Living History Project. Joining me in the interview with Dr. Bishop is Dr. Susan Uden, Professor of Physiology and Biophysics here at the university. This interview is being recorded at the University at Buffalo, where Beverly has been on faculty for 50 years and is presently a distinguished teaching professor in the Department of Physiology and Biophysics. Dr. Bishop has had a truly distinguished research and teaching career for well over 50 years. Beverly has made significant contributions to our understanding of how the nervous system controls muscle activity in humans and in animals, with an emphasis on the respiratory control of muscle. She has also taught physiology to thousands of UB students during her 50 years on faculty, and many of them still feel her influence in their professional lives. You will hear about the development of her career and the circumstances surrounding her research and teaching contributions during this interview. Beverly, welcome to the Living History Project, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed.
Thank you. I view it as a marvelous honor. Thank you very much.
Why don't we start by having you share a little information about your early life and those influences, such as your parents and other individuals who have contributed to your career development.
Oh my, that goes back a long ways. I was a Corning, New York girl. And Corning is a pretty small town. And I grew up there, did my high school training there, and I have very fond memories of it. It's a town known for the glassworks, and the glassworks hire very capable people who had high ideals. They brought a lot of culture to our community. So I got to hear the Buffalo Philharmonic as a youngster. I was introduced to good music, to good theater, thanks to that environment. And I enjoyed my training there very much. And my dad was a jeweler, very highly regarded, even though these were Depression years. He was able to maintain his jewelry business. And I'd even help out sometimes at Christmas time to help sell things, and came to appreciate beautiful things, and I was grateful for that.
Were you interested in science in high school?
I came to enjoy math. Very few girls went into math, and the fellows that went into math weren't very good at it, and so we could excel and show the fellows how to answer the questions, and as a result I did all of the courses that the school offered, and I even got written up in the local paper for receiving 100% on all of the Regents things. So that sort of brought me early fame, and I enjoyed math because it was all so consistent, its own little world. I never learned how to transform it into other things, but I didn't like math. So when I went off to college, that's what I majored in initially. And,
now, where did you go to college?
I went to Syracuse University. I always followed in the footsteps, in the shadow, if you will, of my sister, who was very talented. And it had been a hard decision to send her away. Neither of my parents had ever been to college. This was a whole new experience for the whole family. And she enjoyed Syracuse very much and profited from the education. So there wasn't too much of a question about where I would go. I'd just follow in her footsteps as I had done before. But I majored in math as my first choice, and that was pretty good till after my sophomore year. Because of my major in math, I was invited to apply for a job in New York City. And for the little girl from Corning, New York, to live a summer in New York outside of my parents was pretty exciting. And the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company was where I got that summer job. My colleagues would go off to the Adirondacks and wait table and have a great time. But I went to New York City, lived in what was called the Maggie Lou. That was a YMYWCA. Yes, it was a YWCA, where you had to have a minimum wage. If you were over a certain minimum wage, you didn't get in there. So you can see I was sharing space with a lot of poor girls from many places. That was a good experience, interesting experience. But I found out doing work at Metropolitan Life Insurance Company was not for me. It was in the days before computers, and you used the Marchant calculators, and all the figures that you got, you had to transcribe onto big paper and ink. And if you made a single transcription error, you caught it when the sums were done, and then you had to go back and erase it all. So that convinced me math was not the way to go. So when I got back to Syracuse, I changed to become a psychology major, and that's what I graduated with, was a BA in, well, I guess I had a double major because I'd taken all the math they were offering. One thing happened in math that was interesting. They'd had 3 faculty in the math department when I got there, and they hired a new fellow who was really top flight mathematician, and he thought it was ridiculous to have a separate math from engineering. And so he put all math into engineering courses. So my last years, I had to take my math in the engineering department, but I hadn't had physics at that time. And so this fellow took pity on us and sort of gave us extra tutoring so we would know what the problems that we were solving were all about. And I think that he had a big impact on me. He ultimately became the director of mathematics for the African countries. He wanted to improve their ability. But he was one of the few faculty that we invited to our wedding, and so that was kind of exciting. But
you mentioned your wedding. I'm assuming you met your husband at some point in time?
I did. Because I had done well in the coursework, I was put under the mentorship of a whole committee. They didn't have an honors program or anything like that, but they did take those students that had done well and try to advise them. And this committee was made up of professors whom I not met otherwise, and each of them wanted to direct me into their own fields. There was a biostatistician that thought that was the way I should go with my math, and there was somebody that thought I should go into medicine because of my interest in psychology. And but anyhow, they let me pick my own courses, and as a result, I picked a comparative anatomy course, which was well beyond my level of capability, so it meant I had to work hard. But I can remember that first class, the instructor got up and he said, "Please get to know the person on your left and your right and say hello to them, because that's the only conversation you're going to have. You're going to be so busy in this course." And I still remember Struthers saying that, because it turned out that that fellow to my right became my husband, ultimately. We met there, and Syracuse was a great place in those days. They had, the forestry department was part of the New York State system, so the forestry were well off in terms of funding, and they had a great atrium where they brought in the big bands. And so we danced to the real great bands, and that I had to have permission from my parents in order to stay up late on Saturday nights to go to these big bands, but it was a real occasion. And my husband, wasn't my husband yet, was able to borrow his sister's car, and that was almost unheard of in those days, to have a car in college. So we could drive to the dances, and it was great fun. And so the war broke out. I can still remember the president's discussion of why we were going to war and declaring it. And I was standing we lived in cottages. They didn't have real dorms. They had old houses they'd taken over and converted to living quarters for the women. And so all of the girls in the cottage had gathered around the radio, we didn't have television then, and heard Roosevelt's announcement that we were going to war. And of course that affected every student on campus, male and female. And so the young girls were beginning to think about marrying the fellows who were going to have to go off in the draft. And I discussed this a bit with my parents, and they were so much opposed to it. They would end any financial support of my education. They knew my education was important to me. I just had to finish school if they were going to support me. So I said, oh, you'll have the same argument when we graduate. Oh, no, it'll be all right with us. I said, okay, then we're setting our wedding date, graduation day. And we graduated in the morning, we were married in the afternoon, went off to New York City the next day for a short honeymoon, and that's the story of my life in Syracuse. So,
and where did you proceed to after Syracuse? Did you go on with your education?
I took a little bit of a break there because my husband had an opportunity to study for his PhD at the University of Rochester with the Manhattan Project. I didn't know anything about the Manhattan Project, and in fact I think he knew very little about it other than he would be able to get into toxicology and chemistry. He had graduated as a chemist from Syracuse, so he was well qualified for the job. But I never heard what his work was because it was all confidential. But we moved to Rochester, had an apartment, and I hadn't figured out where I was going, so I got a job with the Girl Scouts and became a counselor for the day camp, took kids on field trips all over Rochester, got to know the area pretty well, but I decided that wasn't really the route for me. I had to find something else. And so I began to look into what was going on in the University of Rochester. And since they didn't have a math program at that time, all of the mathematics faculty had been converted to teaching courses for the people going off to war. So they had a very active psychology department, and after I presented myself to them, they accepted me, which was very nice, and I became a graduate student in the psychology department, and that really shaped my life very much. And one of the courses that I remember so very well was called experimental psychology. They had clinical psychology as well, but I didn't do much with that. But experimental psychology was great. It was taught by a teacher who believed in hands-on teaching, and so we would have laboratory work to do, and we'd have to sit down and discuss it and read the papers that had led to the experiments that we were going to do and get measures on ourselves about very heavily oriented toward visual capabilities. And Bosham Long was supporting I think a lot of Rochester actually, but certainly anything to do with optics and vision. So that was good training. I enjoyed that very much, and I had thought I was going to be interested in learning and memory, but I discovered the psychologists really were interested in the stimulus and the output, but they couldn't care what was in that little black box that got you from stimulus to output. And my master's thesis had people learn nonsense syllables, and then there was all this statistical analysis of the data. It was really pretty boring. I used to say the thing I got the most out of my master's training was to figure out which projects not to do. And so I was really sort of turned off. But by then my husband had finished his PhD and had his first job at Kent State University in the biochemistry department. So I followed him out there, not knowing what I would do. It was during the war. They were very, very short of teachers, and the high school needed teachers, and they wanted one for physics, chemistry, and a math course in which the students were incapable of doing math. They called it business math. And that was quite an eye-opener for me. I'd taken on the job with very short notice because the guy that had been teaching it became the principal of the school. Turned out that he had ordered all kinds of movies for his chemistry and physics courses. And when they came in, they had nothing to do with the curriculum that I'd laid out. And he came to me and he said, "Why are you sending these movies back unused? Why aren't you using them?" And I said, "Well, they don't have any relevance to what I'm..." He said, "What's that got to do with it? If you're showing a movie, you don't have to be teaching." So that immediately turned me off to public education. But I worked hard and enjoyed my students. We would go to Cleveland every weekend to Case Western, and the library was available. And I would sit there and lay out my lesson plans for that next week. I was just about one step ahead of the students because I hadn't had that much training in chemistry or physics. But somehow we survived that year, and then my husband got a real job back here in Buffalo. So I followed him back, and by then I was expecting our son. And I had time off to deliver a 9-pound boy and became a mother. Thoroughly enjoyed it, but found I wasn't very intellectually stimulated. About the only thing I had to do with my brain was that Dr. Talbot, who was chair of medicine here at UB and had hired my husband, was editor of the Journal of Medicine, and he needed somebody to proofread stuff. And so I did all the proofreading for the journal. And that brought in a little bitty money, and I still have the pots, the stainless steel kitchen pots that I bought with the money I'd earned from my proofreading. But I knew I wanted to do more than just be a mother. And so we had neighbors that would take care of a youngster, and my husband talked me into coming to a physiology, I'd never heard the word physiology course at the university in the evening. And that turned me on to physiology. From that day on, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. And interestingly enough, the department took me on as a graduate student, knowing that I would have to work my schedule around a baby. And I started in on my graduate work and took the courses that were expected. And our neighbor took care of the baby while I was at the courses. And then my husband earned a public health fellowship to study in Glasgow. And that was a wonderful opportunity for him. So, of course, I went along with our youngster. We had so little time to plan the trip that we'd built a house in the meantime, and we had to rent that, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we got people that didn't care anything about taking care of the house. They were wonderful on exercise. They'd take their baby out and run the baby car up the hill to Main Street and back down, but they never once got behind a lawnmower. And our neighbors were so distraught at the way our house was going when they knew how we had kept it, that they came over with their sickles and their mowers and got it in shape before we came back home. But the year in Glasgow turned out to be wonderful because I presented myself to the physiology department, and they were delighted to have somebody walk in that would fill an empty chair because they were afraid they'd lose that place. And they didn't realize that in our country, physiologists just study physiology because there a physiologist taught histology as well as physiology. And I was thrown into a laboratory to help with the teaching because I was to be a teaching assistant as well as a graduate student. And I walked into the lab and there were 60 experiments set up around this huge lab. And the instructor was supposed to know what all of those 60 were, and the students would come in and rotate through them over a period of time, so they only had to have 1 or 2 setups of each thing to get all of the students through. And I learned an awful lot of physiology then through that experience. And in Glasgow, at that time, indoor heating was very bad, and it took me a while to find out how they survived. But then we did physical exams as part of the physiology course, and I discovered that everybody was wearing several layers of clothes. And so I promptly went out and bought a new flannel nightgown and got extra underwear and began to live like the Scots lived. And that was a marvelous year.
Who were some of the people you interacted with or were in the department?
Well, I suppose the most important was the chairman of the department, because he had had a marvelous student as an honors student working with him right in the laboratory on the animal experiments. And that honors student was graduating and leaving, and Professor Gary was just devastated that he was not going to have a pair of hands to help him with his animal experiments. So he said, "You do it." He turned over the honors thesis to me. Oh, how I sat there and studied and read that, because it was all new physiology to me. And then I walked into the lab, and for the first time in my life, I saw electronic equipment. I had seen one piece of electronic equipment in Buffalo. We'd been working with chymographs all the years I'd been there, but one day a year the medical students would have the privilege of seeing an EKG machine in a beautiful Hathaway wooden cabinet, and that was my experience. And when I got to Glasgow, they had had a physiologist who just was intrigued with electronic equipment, and he had built everything you could imagine by way of pen recorders and oscilloscopes for Professor Gary's use. And so Professor Gary used to work on the decerebrate cat on a table, and I would stand with my back to him watching the records come out, and I would say to him, "Oh no, that one didn't turn out well. You'll have to do that one again, because we got this glitch and everything." And so we would work along, and when I would leave that room, the assistants, and they had lots of assistants at Glasgow, they'd get me off to the side and they'd say, "Mrs. Bishop, you can't talk to the professor that way." I said, "What do you mean? What did I say?" He said, "You can't tell a professor he's got to do something again." I just found that hilarious, because Americans were really different than the Scottish in so many ways. But it was a wonderful, wonderful year. Our son went to the public school, and sometimes the weather would get so bad the water would freeze, and then the children wouldn't be kept at school and be sent home. Well, that was awkward for me when I was working with the professor to have, and so Mrs. Gary would take Jeffrey, and she was a poet, and she just came to enjoy him very much. And on other days, when he'd get out of school early, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he would come to the lab, and everybody said, "Oh, you can't bring that boy to the lab. Professor Gary doesn't like children." Next thing I knew, Professor Gary and Jeffrey were just playing together. It was hilarious to see, and they had a big impact on his upbringing as well, I think. So our year in Scotland was remarkable in every way.
Now, that was very productive scientifically for you, wasn't it?
Oh, indeed it was. In fact, Professor Gary encouraged me to put in a paper for the IUPS meeting in Brussels, which occurred during the calendar year that we were there. And I hardly knew what an international meeting was, but I prepared well and under his direction for this. It was no posters, just a 10-minute talk. Mine happened to fall on the noon hour, so I didn't have a very big audience, which was probably good, because I was pretty naive at that time. It was pretty exciting. We crossed the, what's out of Dover? The channel. And it was a storm. I was alone. I left the husband and child behind. We'd been across the channel so many times traveling, because we wanted to see as much of Europe as we could, that they got to know us. And when I was there with just my passport without that baby, they really questioned me. But as we stood waiting for the boat to take us across the channel, the waves would come up over the top. And it turned out to be the most frightening crossing. Only crossing I ever had on the ship. But I had a brand new pair of beautiful Scots-made shoes, and there was a bar that I could hold on to, and the bar here, and a seat that moved, and you just held on for dear life. By the time we got to Paris, my shoes were just absolutely ruined, totally curved, and all the suitcases had gotten full of water. The pension where we were supposed to stay in Brussels didn't think we were going to make it. We were so late that they closed the dining room. We hadn't had a thing to eat on the whole day. It was just an amazing thing. They finally found some eggs that they could boil for us, so we didn't go to bed hungry. But it was a crossing to remember. I was just so grateful that I was by myself. I didn't have the rest of the family with me. But that was just the beginning. We stayed in this pension, and we would stand around before we would go off to the meetings and figure out how many noses there were, what the taxi cab was going to cost, or what it would cost to go by a tram. So any joke you've ever heard about the Scots being frugal is an underestimate. We'd sit down to the table and decide whether it was cheaper to buy single glasses of apple juice or a total bottle and share it. Everything, every penny minute. And Professor Gary was most upset that it was the custom to tip everything in Brussels. Oh, you just grumble. That was so wonderful to see. But
So, Beverly, tell me about your first publication.
well, after the Brussels trip, we continued our work in the lab. It went very well, and it was time to write up a paper, a new experience for me. And it went through a lot of revisions within the department. They had a way of getting other people to read it and modify it. A whole new experience. I'd never written a paper in my life. And when it came time to submit it, I was amazed that my name came first. Turned out it was not because of the work I'd contributed, but because my name was Bishop, which was at the beginning of the alphabet. Names were alphabetized. And it was Beverly Bishop, and then all the initials of the males who had been involved, because that was the way the Journal of Physiology did it. Males had initials, females had their full first names, so you knew what you were reading, who had written what you were reading. But Professor Gary had a terrible time for two reasons. First of all, Beverly is a male's name in Britain, and it took him quite a while to convince people that somebody would be stupid enough to name a girl Beverly. And the second was that I was amazed that I was first on the paper because of my name. So I have my first publication in the Journal of Physiology. I'm first author with my full name there, and that started my publication record. I'm very proud of it.
And tell me about the content of the
Oh,
article.
the content of the paper. I rarely talk about that because it's not necessarily a socially accepted topic. I worked on the external anal sphincter of decerebrate cats. Now, physiologists know well what that muscle is, and our work was well received because Professor Gary already had a well-recognized scientific record for his work on colon function and sphincter function. So I really had a head start, and in fact, I brought that work, a continuation of that work, back to become my doctoral thesis, and that's what my doctoral thesis was. And when I'd finished, I was encouraged to move to a more socially acceptable muscle. And so I moved up a ways to the abdominal wall, and that is where I spent most of my early research work, was on the neural control of the abdominal muscles, which are our major expiratory muscle. But
what were some of your findings for the abdominal muscles?
Well, I think everyone knows that they're not very active when you're just sitting around breathing quietly. And yet the minute you have to increase your ventilation for whatever reason, the abdominal muscles have to play a part to have active expiration. So the question I tried to answer was, how were those muscles smart enough to know enough to turn on? And I defined some of the sensory inputs that were responsible for initiating and sustaining rhythmical abdominal activity. And at that time, that was not a popular subject. The neural control of respiration was at least 100 years behind cardiovascular physiology, because patients could be put on ventilators if their rhythm generators stopped. And so it was a long, long time before people asked the right questions about what makes breathing rhythmical. And nowadays, that's a very hot topic and a very popular topic, and one that is getting answered at the molecular level, and that's very exciting. But I used to go to the FASEB meetings and the APS fall meetings regularly, have an abstract, and they never quite knew where to put it, because the people in respiration at that time were interested in gas exchange. We called them the plumbers. Nobody was interested in those that were interested in the neural control, electricians, if you will. And so I'd be putting an oddball segment of the poster sessions or the 10-minute papers or whatever. But I was accepted, and they let me say my little piece. And then that area became very popular. And so I was sort of ahead of the crowd, which was kind of nice, not much competition, you know. I could get papers published, and people would say, well, that's interesting. What does that all mean? So that's where
You received your degree from physiology and biophysics here at Buffalo and under Herman Rahn, and then Herman Rahn had a significant role in your staying here as well.
This Brussels meeting was exciting to me, not only because I presented a paper, but before I left, I understood that Dr. Griffith, our chairman in Buffalo, was retiring, and that we were going to have a new chairman. And I got his name. It was Herman Rahn, and he was to attend the Brussels meeting. So I arranged for us to meet one another. He was very happy to meet with me and discuss what would happen when we both got back to Buffalo. And that was the beginning of what I call my Rahn era. And he became chairman of the department, and very shortly after that, all of 3 people that had been on the faculty of that department left, and Herman Rahn was there to build the department he had brought from Rochester, where he had been for several years and created quite a name for himself. And he brought with him Suki Hong and Bill Ottelman, and those were the first 3 new people. And Herman announced very early on that he wasn't going to take in any graduate students until he got all of those that were there under Griffith's chairmanship out of the way. So for the first few years, there were a few of us that slowly worked our way to the PhD degree level. But in the meantime, he began to recruit really exciting people from all over the world. And he built a postdoctoral program of mostly foreign-trained people. And we had an international department before this university ever thought about international training. And it was very exciting to be there at the time. Claude L'Enfant and John West, Pierre Hobb, and so many from almost everywhere. Otto from Japan. I could go on if I had a list and indicate that we were truly international. And so gradually the graduate students finished up, and I began to wonder what I could do, because I couldn't become a faculty member. First of all, there probably weren't any slots for me, and secondly, my husband was a full-time faculty member at the University of Buffalo, and the nepotism rules said that no 2 people in the same family could be on the faculty. So a clinician had recruited me, and I told Dr. Rahn what I was thinking about doing. And it was one of the few times I saw him sort of lose his temper. He said, "You can't do that. That's not what we trained you for." And I said, "Well, Dr. Rahn, I do have training, and I really want to do something professionally, and there's no chance here. And so he said, well, we'll have to do something about that. You don't want to be an assistant to a clinician. And the next thing I knew, I got a telephone call at home, and he said, Beverly, would you be able to teach a neurophys course for physical therapists? Well, I didn't know who physical therapists were, but I knew I had learned some neurophysiology along the way, and I said, well, yeah, what's it all about? And so he told me Dr. Clark, who had been teaching, of course, was leaving, and they had to have cover for this. And so I said, yes, I'll teach them what I know. It won't be what Dr. Clark taught me. He said, oh, that's all right. Physical therapists don't know what they want anyhow. You find out what they need. Well, I made it my business to find out who physical therapists were, what they did, and what they needed, and it really became a cause for my life. I just felt there was no profession that needed to know more about the nervous system than physical therapists. And so I generated a course that's still in existence. I'm just now in the throes of putting together the 50th course outline for that course. Now, if you think about it, how much have we learned over 50 years? I'm just reading Eric Kandel's book on, what is it, how to make memory?
Learning and memory.
It's his most recent, it's his autobiography. And I can't tell you how much I'm enjoying it because he has lived through the same period. Of course, he became a Nobel laureate, but he has known the work and the people that I have studied and worked in. And it's like reading about your old friends and his interactions with them, and it brings back my memories of working with them. And that's great. So over 50 years, the course has changed very much. I used to teach the whole thing. Now there are 5 of us that teach it, and we have to do an awful lot of selection. But,
now, teaching the physical therapist, however, you were teaching as a part-time instructor, am I correct?
Well, that's the only way I could be hired, yes, because you couldn't have 2 faculty members. So the first thing Herman Rahn did when we became a state institution in 1962, I think on that very day, I remember that day well because we were having, I think, an APS meeting here, and it was the last night that we were a private institution and you could have champagne or anything else you wanted. I remember he had a ice buffalo with a fountain, I think, that you just went and filled your glass with right here in one of these South Campus rooms. And that was when he told me I was to become a full-time faculty member. I still stayed on a 10-month appointment, but I was full-time. I changed that later at the advice of the dean. He didn't want any 10-month people, so I became a 12-month full-time faculty. But the nepotism rules were very, very severe, and they influenced many people. The Van Loos, for example, didn't work in the same building. Judy went to the VA to work because Hugh was in our department, and that sort of thing. But Herman was remarkable in that he created a department with 3 women, which was unheard of at that time. And so I felt very fortunate to be one of the 3. Mm-hmm.
So were you carrying out research at the same time during these years when you were
yes,
as a
yes.
teacher?
No time have I been without research until this immediate past, and I miss it very much. And my advice is never, never stop your experimental work, or you're no longer an active physiologist. And I think that would be my advice to any younger people. Keep your research going. That's for new knowledge. There's nothing more exciting. I just can't think of anything more exciting than to feel that you are seeing something for the first time that nobody else has ever reported. There's just nothing else like it.
You told us earlier, not in the interview, about Herman Rahn's philosophy about getting the most out of faculty. and I think
I love that story.
As a manager myself, I think it's a wonderful a wonderful advice for anybody who's managing people, and I'd like you to share it with us.
Well, Herman hired all of the people. They think of it as Herman's department because he had the opportunity of building a total department, and we've been a very stable department. Many of the people in the department now were hired by him, and yet, because I worked with the physical therapy department, I got to know that chairman, and she would be so excited that she was hiring somebody new, and she'd just talk about the individual for so long. And about a month or two after that individual had been on the scene, all I would hear would be negative comments. Can't do this, he can't do that, he's just no good at this. And I'd say to Herman, now, why is it that everyone you've gotten has stayed? You accept what they do? They're fulfilling their jobs? And he said, oh, Beverly, I've hired them and they didn't do what I expected they would at all. He said, but I would just watch them. He said, everybody has talents. And I'd figure out what they could do. And then he said, I would needle them and I would get on their backs and see that they would really push forward. And it was true. He opened doors, he showed you new ways to think about things, and he knew what everybody was doing, and he recognized their talent. He emphasized their talents. And I think he made very few errors in his selection of the faculty, and we got on very well as a cohesive team that all were as different as could be. All kinds of personalities. And you immediately recognized the differences, and that was the joy of the department. And so I thought that was a wonderful thing that he shared, and it should be passed on to anybody who's going to become an executive in an executive position.
Herman was also influential in your becoming a member of the American Physiological Society.
Oh my, yes. You know, when I became a member, it was viewed as a tremendous honor. And membership was studied. Anybody that applied for membership, their curriculum vitae, their publication records, were studied much as our PRBs do now in terms of selecting people for tenure. And to be accepted into the society was a great honor. And once you became accepted into the society, you were expected to participate in the society in any way that you could. And Herman was always there to point out ways that you might contribute. And once you got involved, you were accepted and did things. And he would see to it, for example, that I would go to the respiration dinners, for example. Even though I was in neural control and not gas exchange, I was still accepted by the group to go to, and I'd be the only woman in a room of 100 men. So it was kind of easy to get to be known. And so I think that led to my selection to chair sessions, and once you chair a session, an audience gets to at least know your name and that sort of thing. So before I knew it, I was selected to be a member of different committees. You only are on one committee at a time, but over the years I've served on many committees, both as member and as chairman. Still serving, I'm chairman of the senior committee. I pointed out to the young women what they were headed for. But I'm enjoying that as well, and I have learned that physiologists must know something about the body because they do live longer, it seems like, than most people. We have so many that are 100-year-olds, 90-year-olds, 80-year-olds. We greet them all for their birthdays. And so that's one committee that probably younger people don't think much about, but those who receive letters or cards are asked to advise the younger people. And some of those letters are very interesting that get published. And I read the one I wrote at my 80th birthday.
Yes.
I sent you a copy.
I read it, yes.
And
enjoyed reading
I thought it sounded pretty good. You know?
Yes.
I didn't know how I would change it if I had to rewrite it on my 90th.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing that.
We will give you a chance to do it on your 90th.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You said you went to lots of meetings, but as opposed to most of us who hopped on the train or got on a commercial flight, you and Charles did it a little bit differently.
Yes, we flew our own plane, and we have always flown together as a team. Charles, after a while, got his instrument rating, which gave us much more capability because you never knew when you took off what kind of weather you were going to get into, and if you were on VFR flight plan, you landed and waited for the weather to change. But once he got an instrument rating, he became chief pilot and he became chief navigator. I got very good at Loran C, and then more recently we've had the GPS. And I never found that intuitive. I think there must be more accidents by pilots trying to figure out their GPS and using all of its capabilities than they are while they're flying. But that's beside the point. We enjoyed flying. We've flown in every state in the Union. In Alaska, we rented a plane, and same in Hawaii. But in continental United States, we've been in every state. It's the only way to see the country. And we went to many, many meetings by plane. If we ever went by commercial, people would say, "What are you doing here on a commercial flight? You know, you have your own plane. What's it doing?" And we would only go commercial if our schedules were tight and we had to be someplace, because weather is the major problem that you are apt to encounter in flying. And so we just played it safe every time. And we went to New Orleans in one of their famous rainstorms and couldn't get into the airport there, had to land outside and take a shuttle into the meetings. But one way or another, we always got where we wanted to go by flying.
But you also did a lot of international meeting traveling, going to international congresses, and obviously you didn't fly there.
No, commercial. And we took advantage of as many IUPS meetings as we could. It was a wonderful way to see the world. It was a wonderful way to learn about physiology that's going on in other places. And there's one coming up in Japan, and we went to the first one in Japan, and that was a wonderful experience. I was invited to lecture at Kyoto for that one, and I'm sure that the person who invited me, the chair of the department, didn't know I was a woman, and so I wrote back and said how happy I'd be to give a lecture, and that he realized that I'd be traveling with my husband. So he changed his entertainment style to include the women. It was very good for the Japanese women because for the first time some of them got to go to a restaurant and to go out in the car with the chauffeur to be shown the countryside, and the homes were not open to us. On one occasion there had been an individual who had studied in this country, and he was quite happy to open his home to us, but that's not the way the Japanese did things in those days. This was right after the first, it was the first scientific meeting that the Japanese had after the war. And what a wonderful job they did. They're great hosts and hostesses anyhow, but they must have been trained by the Physiology Society in that country to go the extra mile, because it didn't matter where you went.
Well, Susan and I will look forward to your being our guide when we go to Kyoto in 2009.
So tell me, Beverly, you're a distinguished teaching professor here in the SUNY system. How did you go about developing your teaching expertise?
Well, I think it all started in that Rochester course. I've thought back about it, and that experimental psychology course was so meaningful to me in terms of gaining new information that I could really use, that I decided that was a useful method. It was so great when we could teach in the laboratory, and it is still great to me when students can do things on their own. And as far as I know, I'm the only person in the department that still insists upon two 2 hands-on labs for the dental teaching and for my neurophysiology course. But it's getting harder and harder every year to do it. First, we don't have the space, and secondly, you don't have the support from the administration. In dental school, I mentioned how difficult it was to find a place to hold my sensory lab, for example. The fellow said, nobody else is doing labs anymore. You don't have to do them. You know, with that kind of attitude on the side of the administration, there's not very much encouragement to do it. And yet, when I do those labs, the students just come alive. It's so much better than sitting in the lecture room and hearing about stuff. It's so much better to stick your fingers in 2 temperatures of water and then stick them in and find out they feel different. I mean, how do you teach temperature sensation in an easier way? Something that you can do, and all these simple things that a lot of them have been moved back to the high school, but it's like, I tell them, it's like going to the San Francisco Exploratorium, except you don't have to pay to get in. And they do visual things, and there are about, I think we have 18 stations. And then they have to prepare, they don't know ahead of time which one they're going to have to prepare, so they do them all. And then they have to report to the class, and they have to prepare a 5 or 10 minute talk on it and present it to the whole class. And when they do that, it's amazing how much effort they have put into it. And I get a big charge out of it, and I don't have to lecture. I let them do the work. It's just the way it should be.
So how did you develop all of these ideas and this kind of approach?
We started out as an experimental. I think neurophysiology is an experimental science, and when I had to leave the lab, I couldn't teach it in the lab anymore. I just thought that was awful, so I brought my husband's camera and then took pictures of the preparations and made slides and recorded things and had slide tape recordings, and the students really liked that. And so I thought, why do I just have to stick with the laboratory stuff? And I began to make slide tapes. I think I made 42 lectures in 7 different books of these. And it was about the same time that APS
late 60s, early 70s.
Got into this, and I was ahead of them. And so I had a sample of what they were talking about doing, and they evaluated it much as you would have a journal article reviewed, and they put their stamp of approval on it. And next thing I knew, they were actually producing these tapes, having very outstanding scientists prepare these tapes, and they got a commercial outfit to box them up. You'd never believe how long it took me to find the right boxes to put in, because I had a whole set of them. 10, 15 students could listen at a time in our little room downstairs. And so the APS said, well, do you want us to advertise your tapes the same way? I said, sure. So I got royalties back, and still builds my neurophysiology fund that helps support some of our neuroscience events that are going on right now. And that was great. That brought attention from a whole lot of different. I had one fellow in Australia that wrote to me, and he said he thought the slide tapes were wonderful, but would I mind if I'd sent the manuscript so he could tape them and they'd understand the Australian rather than the American English? And I said, only if you send me a tape back to hear what it is. But so that was great. And then when they became old hat and the technology was bypassed with the computers, it took a while to figure out how to move to the new technology. And I was very fortunate. We had John Muntz was here at the university at that time, and he introduced me to some of the tools and emphasized the power of PowerPoint and showed me a bit how to get going on it. And that I was the first one to develop PowerPoint lectures, and the audiovisual people were helpful. They found a computer and a projector that I could use in a classroom. Of course, they locked it up in a special closet, and they had to be called and be there ahead of time to get it set up and everything. But I like that very much, and so it became a way of life, and I'm now hopefully creating illustrated lectures in about 4 or 5 different areas that I hope someday will go to the archives of APS and other people can use them, because I'm now excited about circadian rhythm, sleep, still interested in control, respiration. Things have to be brought up to date, bring us up at least to the molecular level. But I've got to get started on all of them, and I find that challenging. It doesn't quite take the place of actual hands-on experiments, but keeps the neurons firing.
Beverly, there were many influences on your research that came from your teaching and from your students. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Teaching and research were so integrated in my thinking and my work that it's very hard to separate them out. When I was teaching the physical therapists, for example, you really wondered why would icing or brushing or those procedures that they were using, why did they work? And we'd raise those questions, and before long I found out we could establish a lab over at the VA and get some real answers, and then we could test them first on normal humans, and then test them on patients and find out what was going on. So yes, many of my papers came out of questions that students would raise from coursework. And if people were to look at my bibliography, I've sat around study tables enough evaluating CVs. I could hear them say, "Oh, but she's been so unfocused," because I've worked with tonic vibration reflex, I've worked with pain, I've worked with neuroplasticity, all of these things. How do you put them together? But I'm a full systems physiologist, and all of these things do fit together, and my students have been the instigators of many of the experimental work that I have done. Jim Russell, for example, was among the first to monitor what was going by recording directly from gamma fibers what was going on in the muscle spindles of the respiratory muscles. He's one of the few that has done that. We didn't do that kind of recording in my lab, but rather we figured out that you could elicit the Achilles tendon reflex in 2 ways, one mechanically by tapping, and the other by electrically stimulating the popliteal fossa. And we could evoke reflex responses with these 2 different stimuli. And if we matched the response, we could assume that we were activating the same fraction of the alpha motor neuron pool. And then we could try different things like high pressure, put them in the pressure chamber, and see when neurological events started happening, which was affected first, the alphas or the gammas, how much did they change? Because if you had no change in the mechanical response, then the alpha action potential would stay the same as the other. And using that paradigm got the students to really understand the neural circuitry we were talking about, and we were able to put it to practical use to assess some of the physical therapy techniques. For example, students use brushing and icing, and look at stroke patients where there might be a disruption, so we could talk about alpha rigidities and gamma rigidities, and have them understand motor control from those things. So that was pretty exciting along the way. And I've had some postdocs that got started with me. For example, Dr. Arita was with me for 3 years and really got to understand the respiratory system, but I always was working out in the periphery. He went back to Japan and developed the ability to record from neurons in the respiratory center itself and document some of the things that we had hypothesized on the basis of our reflex responses. And that's just been intellectually very stimulating, and I think very real world for the students that have worked with me. And in terms of teaching, supervised teaching has been appreciated by some of the people that have gone out. They've actually written back letters saying how much they had learned by teaching in my course, and that they have adopted many of the teaching techniques that I have used. One girl who was really a very, very competent individual, but very independent, and she'd started in nursing. She didn't like the way she was treated by the doctors on their first visit to a hospital, so she dropped the nursing program and decided she was going to major in physiology. And she, as an undergraduate, took every physiology course that was offered by our department, and then she applied to become a graduate student, and everybody recognized she had the ability, but I was sort of taken aside and said she's not a student that we would like to continue. It would do her better to be someplace else. So she applied to other places and was accepted at all of them, and decided to go to San Diego. When she got there, she I don't know if she was hired or just voluntarily became a tutor to those students that were having difficulty. And word got out at how good she was at tutoring. She began to get all of the students coming to her sessions, and before long the faculty had to go to find out what she was doing. This was in John West's department, and she got hired to do this because she was helping those that were having difficulty to get through. But then she turned her attention to better ways of teaching, and before you knew it, she was doing the audiovisual, and San Diego is just miles ahead. Excuse me to the audiovisual people out here, but San Diego just was so far ahead in terms of their ability to help the faculty improve. And she literally created her own job. And I sort of take pride because her first teaching experiences were in my laboratory course, and she would come and she would just be beside herself with the evaluations. Some students thought this was perfect, and some students thought this was true. How can they be in the same room and think that? And so we would discuss, what is it that is good about teaching, what's bad about teaching. And she often has said that she got her start from that direction. And those are the things, they're kind of the reward that you have. And I've influenced many physical therapy students over the years in terms of how they teach or what they have done, how they've thought about things. And those are the rewards that a teacher gets. And my publications fall across a wide range of journals depending upon what the topic was. So I have a lot in experimental physiology. I have a lot in the APS journals. I didn't get into Journal of Physiology again, though, after that first paper. But
you had a good start in your career.
Absolutely.
Right. Do you have any advice you would give for a new researcher starting out?
I think anybody who enjoys science, recognizes the value of science, and really is swept up into it, should just do their thing. They won't become millionaires, but they will have a lifetime of wonderful experiences and have tremendous satisfaction at the end. But they have to give it their all, and it has to be very important to them. If that's not their bag, go do something else. But I think if you're going to be a scientist, you really got to question things and try to be objective about everything.
Beverly, over the 50 years of your career, neurophysiology has changed immensely.
Yes.
From your perspective, do you have any thoughts about what the future looks like?
Oh, I think it's extremely positive. That's why I want to stick around as long as I can, because I think that neurology is going to change. Well, all of medicine is going to change, but probably neurology will change more than any other facet of medicine as we learn more and more about the brain. It's not going to come fast, but the steps that are being taken and the information that's coming along holds such a promising future that it's just, that's what keeps me going. I think it's all about, think of the progress. Think, why are people living longer? Why am I still here at 85? I take 10 pills in the morning because medicine, pharmacology, physiology are better understood. I hate those pills, but I'm very happy to be here, so I take them regularly.
And we're glad you're here as well. Beverly, I wanted to thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for the Society's Living History Project. It's been an honor for me, and I think I can say it's been an honor for Susan, to be able to sit here and learn about your life, learn about your career. And on behalf of the Society, I'd like to say thank you.
Oh, thank you, Marty. It's been more pleasure to me. I just never have had the chance to talk about or even think about my life before. So thanks to the APS and to you. And Susan is here because she introduced me at a recent lecture at Roswell Park where we talked about Nobel laureates and how they'd affected our life. And that introduction just made me glow. And so thank you very much, and thank you for coming all the way from Washington to be here at UB on one of the most beautiful days we've had this spring.